All right, Ashley County. Now, listeners, you are not going to believe this. Get this. We have a deep dive that goes into research that's about something that was found right here in Ashley County. How cool is that?
It is pretty cool. We're going to be talking about the bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal remains that were found at a place called the Sheppard site. It's also known as 3AS 437, if you want to get technical, but we're going to be talking about the people who lived here long ago and what their lives may have been like, and also how they died.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the research paper that we're looking at, it's by Dr. Melissa Zabecki, and it's from October 2011. But get this, these skeletal remains, they weren't just like sitting in a museum somewhere. They were actually used to teach forensic anthropology students, which I think is super cool.
Yeah, like future scientists learning about the past from something found right here in Ashley County. I mean, come on, that's pretty amazing. So.
Yeah, so what exactly are we trying to find out in this deep dive today?
We're going to take a look at Dr. Zabecki's analysis and see what we can learn about the people who were found at the Sheppard site, their age, their sex, their health, and even how they were buried.
I mean, the incident. So the skeletal material was found here in Ashley County, but then what happened?
Well, they were sent to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey in Fayetteville back in November 2010,
Okay.
and they started cleaning them like with water screening to get the mud off. But then they stopped because they wanted Dr. Zabecki to do a full analysis, like a bioarchaeological analysis. So, using science to learn about past people through their bones.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to mess with anything before the expert gets a look at it.
Yeah.
But so then what happened to the remains?
Well, Dr. Zabecki got permission to use them in her forensic anthropology class.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at the University of Arkansas, Fort Smith. So she took the remains to Fort Smith in January of 2011 and kept them safe at the AAS Fort Smith Survey Station until March when the class started working with them.
Wow, so the students actually got to work with these ancient remains.
They did. They got to clean them and sort them, which is a really cool hands-on experience, right?
I mean, that is so cool. I wish I could have taken that class. So after the students were done, what happened to the bones then?
Well, they were sent back to the AS in Fayetteville in May 2011, and then Dr. Zabecki, she went through and did a really thorough analysis of all the material between August and October 2011, because the students were just beginners and the remains were pretty fragmented.
Yeah. So let's talk about those fragments. What kind of condition were the bones in when they got to Fayetteville?
Well, they were all mixed up together, what we call commingled, and a lot of them were still covered in mud. The preservation of the bone itself was pretty good, but they had been damaged during excavation, with like shovel marks and things like that.
Oh, no, shovel marks. So sad. Well, at least the bones themselves were. Okay, what about complete skeletons? Were any of the skeletons complete?
No, they were mostly just fragments. No complete long bones, except for a few tiny ones from subadults, which are, kids and teenagers and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so how did they go about cleaning and sorting all those bone fragments?
Well, the students cleaned them really carefully with water and soft brushes, and then they let them dry completely before they even touched them, and they had to sort through everything to figure out, which bone was which.
Oh, yeah, that must have been a huge job, especially since they were all broken up.
It was a big job, but it was important because they needed to figure out how many people were represented in all those fragments. That's called the minimum number of individuals, or MNI.
So how many people did they find?
Well, at first they thought there were 15 people because they found 15 mandibles, which are the jaw bones. But when they looked at all the other bones, it seemed like there were only 5 adults and 6 subadults. So that's kind of weird.
Yeah, why do you think there were so many more mandibles than other bones?
That's a good question. The report actually talks about that later when they discuss burial practices. They think that maybe some bones, like maybe the jaw bones, were treated differently or maybe even reburied separately.
Oh, that's interesting. So what about the other bones? Could they tell if they were from males or females?
Yeah, they could tell the sex of 6 of the adults. 3 were male and 3 were female, but they couldn't tell for the other 2 adults because the bones were too fragmented.
So what about age? Could they tell how old these people were?
Well, for the adults, they estimated that they were all over 30 years old, and one of them was really old, like between 50 and 59.
Wow, that's old. Especially for back then. What about the subadults? What did they find out about them?
Well, they found 2 fetuses that were about 7 and 9 months gestational age, which means they were almost ready to be born. And then they found 2 infants that were less than a year old and a child that was between 4 and 5 years old and a young woman who was probably around 19 years old.
Wow, so sad to think about all those babies and children dying so young. But it gives us a sense of the community, doesn't it?
It does. It shows that there are people of all ages living here together, but it also makes you think about how hard life must have been back then.
Yeah, for sure. So aside from just their age and sex, what else did they learn about these people? Did they find any signs of illness or injury?
Well, they found some interesting things. The oldest individual, the one who was over 50, he had a lot of osteoarthritis in his spine, knees, and hands, and he had also broken a few bones in his feet.
Ouch, that sounds painful.
It probably was. It seems like he lived a really physically demanding life. Maybe he was a farmer or a hunter or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the other adults? Did any of them have any health problems?
Yeah, another adult who was probably in his 40s, he had some arthritis too, but not as bad as the older guy. And they had a radius bone that had a healed fracture, but it had healed crooked.
Oh, broken arm. I wonder how that happened. Did they mention anything about how they treated broken bones back then?
They didn't, but it's interesting to think about, right? I mean, did they have splints or casts, or did they just let it heal on its own?
Yeah, this we'll never know. But they did find something else too, right? Something about anemia.
Oh, yeah, they found two skulls that had signs of parodic hyperostosis, which is a condition that can be caused by iron deficiency anemia.
So they may not have been getting enough iron in their diet.
Yeah.
What do you think they were eating back then that could have caused that?
Well, that's a good question. It could have been a lot of things. Maybe their diet wasn't very diverse, or maybe they had some kind of parasitic infection that was preventing them from absorbing iron properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they also found someone with a sinus infection, right?
Yeah, one of the skulls had signs of an active sinus infection when the person died.
Oh, yuck. That's no fun. So all in all, it seems like this group of people had a few health problems, but nothing too out of the ordinary, right?
Yeah, that's right. They had some arthritis, some broken bones, some anemia, and a sinus infection, but they didn't have any signs of major trauma or widespread infection, which is interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what their lives were like. Were they peaceful or were they constantly fighting or something? Yeah.
That's a good question, but unfortunately, the bones can't tell us everything. What about their teeth? Did they find anything interesting about their teeth?
Yeah, the report mentions that some of the teeth were worn down, which makes sense since they didn't have toothbrushes or dentists back then, but they didn't have many cavities, which is surprising.
That is surprising. Maybe their diet wasn't as sugary as ours is today.
Yeah, maybe so, but some of them did lose teeth before they died, probably from decay.
Yeah, that's true. So their dental health was kind of mixed bag, but now let's talk about something really interesting, their burial practices.
Okay, so tell me about that. What did they find out about how these people were buried?
Well, all the remains were found in a really small area, like only 2 meters by 1 meter, which is pretty tiny considering they think there were at least 11 people buried there.
Wow, yeah, that is small. So how did they all fit in there?
Well, that's the interesting part. They don't think they were buried in the normal way, lying down in an extended position. They think they were probably buried in a secondary burial.
A secondary burial, what's that?
Well, it means that the bodies weren't buried right away. They were probably left somewhere else to decompose first, and then later on their bones were collected and moved to this final resting place.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. Why would they do that?
We don't know for sure, but it could have been for a lot of reasons. Maybe they didn't have enough space for individual graves, or maybe they believed that the soul needed time to separate from the body before it could be buried permanently.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So is there any evidence to support this idea of a secondary burial?
Yeah, there are actually a few clues. First of all, when the students were cleaning the bones, they found some clumps of dirt that had vertebrae and ribs that were still connected, which suggests that some of the skeletons were still partially articulated when they were moved to the Sheppard site.
Oh, that's cool. Like a little snapshot of the process.
Exactly. And another clue is that the bones were preserved differently. Some were in better shape than others, which suggests that they were exposed to different environments before they were finally buried together.
So all those clues point to a secondary burial, but why is that important?
Well, it tells us something about their beliefs about death and the afterlife, and it also shows that they may have had limited space for burials, which could tell us something about their population size or their settlement patterns.
Yeah, that makes sense. So aside from the burial practices, did they find anything else interesting about the skeletons themselves, like any weird bones or anything?
Well, yeah, there are a few things that stood out. For example, they found a sternum that was asymmetrical with a really big notch for the first rib on the left side. And they found some kneecaps that had signs of degenerative joint disease, like eburnation and arthritic lipping.
So basically their knees were all messed up.
Pretty much. They also found vertebrae from at least 4 or 5 different individuals, some of which were fused together, which could have been caused by a birth defect or an injury, and others had arthritis. And they found a female clavicle that was 137 millimeters long, which is a pretty normal size for a woman.
Okay, what about the arm bones? Did they find anything interesting about those?
Yeah, they found 2 radii that were different sizes. which could mean that they were from a male and a female, or it could just be that people back then had more variation in their bone sizes than we do today. They also found a complete femur from a young woman that was 413 millimeters long, and a more robust femur from a man that had degenerative joint disease and a destructive lesion,
Yeah.
which is a fancy way of saying that there was something wrong with his bones.
Oh, no, a destructive lesion. That sounds bad.
Yeah, it could have been a tumor or an infection or something like that. We don't know for sure, but it definitely wasn't good. And remember how we talked about how there were way more mandibles than other bones? Well, they also found that the mandibles were preserved differently, which again supports the idea that they might have been treated differently than the other bones.
Wow. So many interesting details about these skeletons.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the lives of these people, doesn't it?
It does. It's amazing what we can learn from bones, even after all these years. But speaking of learning, what about the other things they found at the site? Did they find anything besides human bones?
Yeah, they found some other stuff too, like pottery fragments, animal bones, shell fragments, and some tiny stone tools called microliths, and even found a piece of glass.
A piece of glass, huh? That's interesting. What could that mean?
Well, it could mean that the site was used at a later time period, or maybe it was just a piece of trash that someone dropped there more recently. But most of the other artifacts seem to be from before Europeans arrived in this area.
Okay, so what about the animal bones? Did they tell us anything about what these people were eating?
Well, some of the animal bones were burned, which means they were probably cooked and eaten. And they also found a piece of turtle shell that had a hole in it.
A hole in it. What do you think that was for?
Well, they think it might have been a pendant or some kind of decoration.
Wow, a turtle shell pendant. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
It's like a little glimpse into their personal lives and their sense of style.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up, we've learned a lot about the people who lived at the Sheppard site, haven't we?
We've learned about their age, their sex, their health, their burial practices, and even a little bit about their diet and their personal adornments.
And all of this happened right here in Ashley County, which is amazing. It really brings history to life, doesn't it?
It does. It shows that Ashley County has a rich and fascinating past that goes back thousands of years.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what other secrets are still hidden beneath our feet, just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And that's what makes archaeology so exciting. There's always something new to learn about the past and about ourselves.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but we hope you enjoyed learning about the Sheppard site and the people who lived there long ago.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another fascinating glimpse into the past.
Until then, keep exploring and keep wondering.
And remember, Ashley County's history is your history.
Thanks for listening.